Hello, Isaac here. So in the last video, we saw how Philo gave an account of how Gaius Caligula turned from a widely praised emperor, adored by all, to a megalomaniac that looked upon himself as greater than even the supreme deities of the world, Mercury, Apollo, and Mars. And how this led to a deep suspicion of the Jewish nation, as they seemed to be the only people on earth that refused to acknowledge this new divine status. Philo then tells us how, after an initial meeting with the emperor on the banks of the Tiber, before the embassy proper, terrible news arrived from Jerusalem. What was this news? Well, it turned out that Caligula had designs to set up a statue of himself in the very temple in Jerusalem. Philo, before he gets to his account of the final embassy, will tell us how Caligula came to these designs to set up a statue of himself in the temple, and the very last minute change of heart because of the intervention of none other than King Herod Agrippa I. According to Philo, this desire of Caligula to set up a statue of himself in the temple begins with the events which happened in the city of Jamnia. Here, the non-Jewish population had put up an altar in honor of Gaius Caligula, but this was probably considered to be a desecration of the Holy Land by the Jewish population, and they destroyed this altar. The Roman procurator Herennius Capito reported this to the emperor, who became enraged, and in response, he decided to implement this plan to have a statue of himself erected in the temple in Jerusalem. Caligula then gave orders to the proconsul of the province of Syria, Publius Petronius, to implement this plan. Petronius, however, was very reluctant to attempt what he was commanded to do, as he understood the injustice of it, and it would ultimately lead to a terrible war. Thus, Petronius used the fashioning of the statue as a pretext for a delay, in the hope that the emperor would relent on this request. He also sent for magistrates of the Jews, and the priests and the rulers of the people, to both announce to them the commands of Gaius and to ask them to give consideration as to the danger before their eyes. But in response to this news, a whole multitude of Jews hastened to Phoenicia to speak to Petronius and to petition him to change his mind, telling him that they would willingly give up all their possessions, their lives, and everything before they allowed a statue to be brought into the temple. And they begged him with groans and tears to delay, so they could appoint an embassy to entreat the emperor to change his mind. As a result, Philo tells us that Petronius sympathized with their sorrows, for he was by nature a man very kind and gentle in his natural disposition. Petronius therefore urged the artist to take even longer labouring on the statue, but he didn't want to grant them an embassy as he didn't consider it safe to allow it. Instead, he sent a letter to Gaius explaining the delay is not because of a regard for the Jews, but for the sake of providing for the collection of the harvest. Gaius was furious and exasperated by this letter, but Philo notes that he concealed this in his response, and instead praised him for his careful and accurate consideration of the future, and then at the end of the letter made it clear that he desired the speedy erection of the statue once the harvest had come in. Shortly after the secretary of Gaius had written this letter to Petronius, King Agrippa of Judea had arrived in Rome to pay his respects to the emperor, but he apparently hadn't even heard of the whole affair or what Gaius had requested in his previous epistles. When King Agrippa did finally hear of it, from the mouth of Gaius himself, Philo tells us that he fell into such a state of grief that he changed into all sorts of colours, becoming at the same moment bloodshot and pale and livid, for he was all over agitation and trembling from the top of his head to his feet, and a quivering and shaking has seized upon him, and disordered all his limbs and every member of his body, all his sinews, and muscles and nerves being relaxed and enfeebled, so that he fainted away. After he fainted, he was carried home, and he lay in a profound stupor all day and for a large part of the next. But once he recovered his energy, he took some writing tablets to compose a letter to Gaius. And although he was in a position to make a personal appeal to the emperor, to speak to him face to face in Rome, he seems to have felt that the best chance for success lay not in personal, face-to-face appeal, but in a written letter sent from across town. And so the letter begins. "O master, fear and shame have taken from me all courage to come into your presence to address you, since fear teaches me to dread your threats, and shame, out of respect for your greatness of your power and dignity, keeps me silent. But a writing will show my request, which I now here offer to you as my earnest petition." This petition begins by defending the piety that the Jewish nation has shown towards the emperor, and then goes on to make his supplication on behalf of the temple. He writes, "O my lord and master Gaius, this temple has never, from the time of its original foundation until now, admitted any form made by hands, because it has been the abode of God. Now, pictures and images are imitations of those gods who are perceptible to the outward senses, but it was not considered by our ancestors to be consistent with the reverence due to God to make any image or representation of the invisible God." He then appeals to the wonder and respect the family of Gaius held for the temple itself. For example, Marcus Agrippa, his grandfather on his mother's side, travelled to the temple in Jerusalem and adored the decorations of the priests and the piety and holiness of the people of the country. And he could talk of nothing else to his companions but the magnificence of the temple and everything connected with it. He then goes on to recount a situation which happened under Pontius Pilate, the previous Roman governor of the province of Judea, in order to emphasize the real gravity of putting a statue in the Holy of Holies. Apparently, Pilate dedicated some gilt shields to Tiberius in the palace of Herod. No form nor any forbidden thing was represented, but when the multitude heard of what had been done, there was an uproar, and the magistrates entreated Pilate to alter and rectify the innovation which had been done. After Pilate refused this petition, a threat of war was on the cards. But those in power of the nation decided to write a letter to Tiberius, and when he read it, he immediately wrote a letter back commanding Pilate to take down the shields and send them away from Judea. Now, given that this was just a shield in the dwelling of the governor, how much more would there be uproar if there was an actual statue put in the innermost part of the temple, the very Holy of Holies, which is visited once a year by the high priest? Finally, King Agrippa asks Gaius, "How many deaths then do you not suppose that the people, who have been taught to regard this temple with such holy reverence, would willingly endure rather than see a statue introduced into it? I verily believe that they would rather slay all their whole families, with their wives and children, and themselves last of all in the ruins of their houses and families, and Tiberius knew this well." Then reminds him that Augustus and his successors had commanded that no one should hinder the Jews in their obedience to national laws of Jerusalem. And finally, he makes a personal appeal to Gaius to retract it on behalf of him. For Herod Agrippa I had been appointed as king by Gaius over the whole of Judea in AD 37. In fact, he was the first to be called king since his grandfather, Herod the Great, who had died almost 40 years earlier. But these actions of the emperor towards the temple in Jerusalem would put his sovereignty into question. For he writes, "Do not then, O master, after having loaded me with means of superfluity, deprive me of what is actually necessary. Do not, after having raised me up to the most brilliant light, cast me down again for imminence to the most profound darkness. I will give up everything. I look upon everything as of less importance than the one point of preserving the ancient customs and laws of my nation unaltered. For, if they were violated, what can I say, either to my fellow countrymen or to any other men? It would follow, of necessity, that I would be looked upon as one of two things, either as a betrayer of my people or as one no longer accounted by a friend by you. In other words, he's been put in an impossible situation, as he either becomes an enemy of Caesar or betrayer of his people. Either way, he would lose his kingship. Herod Agrippa sent this letter to Gaius and sealed himself in his house as he anxiously waited for a response, for impending danger was on a knife edge. As Philo writes, they had reason to apprehend the expulsion from their country and slavery and utter destruction as impending not only over those who were dwelling in the Holy Land, but over all the Jews in every part of the world. Therefore Agrippa had to step in and test his luck, as Josephus writes, and thus did Agrippa venture to cast the die upon this occasion. So great was the affair in his opinion, and in reality, though he knew how dangerous a thing it was, so to speak, for had not Gaius approved it, it had tended to no less than the loss of his life. The emperor, although initially angry at the letter because it stirred against his intentions, he was moved by the appeal of his friend, and decided to grant Herod Agrippa his wishes, and therefore he relented on erecting a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem, and sent a letter to Publius Petronius, the governor of Syria, to no longer implement the plan. And so Jerusalem and its temple are saved because of the final and last-minute appeal of Herod Agrippa, and whether it was for his own self-preservation or a love for his country and its customs, he ultimately prevented a terrible war from happening. And so we continue on to Philo and the embassy. And so, within that context, Philo and his embassy, probably after many months of waiting, are finally called into the presence of the emperor to make their case. But Philo makes clear from the outset that this conversation was a complete farce. He tells us that the moment we entered into the presence of the emperor, we perceived, from his looks and from the state of his agitation in which he was, that we had come not before a judge, but before an accuser, or rather, I should say, before the open enemy of those whom he looked upon as opposed to his will. Philo then tells us how the proceedings should have taken place. That is, both parties should have stood on each side of him, so that he could listen in turn to their cases, first the accusation, then to defense, and then a judge should have made a deliberation with his assessors to deliver a sentence on the justice of the case. Instead, however, the conversation took place in Gaius' villa, and the case put forth by the Jewish ambassadors is repeatedly interrupted while Gaius walks around his villa, conferring with the decorators on such topics as the new windows he was going to have installed. This left no doubt that he was never really interested in giving them a fair hearing. Philo tells us when they first met him, they greeted him with respect and adoration, bending to the ground and saluting him, the Emperor Augustus. But the first words of Caligula are immediately adverse, for he says, "You are haters of God, inasmuch as you do not think that I am a god. I who am already confessed to be a god by every other nation, but who am refused that appellation by you." The ambassadors on the opposing side jumped on this, calling Gaius by every title applicable to the gods, to make clear to Gaius the obstinance of these Jews. Philo and his delegation in response make clear their loyalty to him, and that they have already offered up sacrifices for him on 3 occasions already, when he succeeded as emperor, recovered from his terrible illness, and finally in hope for his victory over the Germans. Gaius grants the truth of this, but dismisses these sacrifices as they were to another god, and they didn't sacrifice to him. When Philo and his companions heard this expression of sacrificing to him, they are completely bewildered, and there is really nothing they can say. But again, while this is happening, they are following him up and down his estate as he gives orders to his decorators. Finally, when he had given his orders about the building, he asked another question in jest to the Jews. "Why is it that you abstain from pig's flesh?" Well, this led to an eruption of laughter from the Greek embassy, and although they tried to answer him, making it clear that different nations have different laws and that some people do not eat lamb's flesh, the emperor just laughed and said, "They are quite right, for it's not nice." Finally, Gaius moves on to ask what principles of justice the Jews recognize regarding their constitution. But when they begin to reply, they are cut short as he runs into the principal building, commanding the windows were filled with transparent pebbles. Then, once again, returning to the legation asking, "What were you saying?" But then immediately running off into another house where he commanded some ancient and admirable pictures to be placed. This whole affair is therefore infuriating for this Jewish delegation, who have been waiting to meet with the emperor for a very long time, only for him to be entirely preoccupied with his own villa decorations. Finally, Gaius just puts an end to the whole discussion and dismisses them, giving his final judgment that these men do not appear to me to be wicked as much as unfortunate and foolish in not believing that I have been endowed with the nature of God. And so that was the abrupt end to the long anticipated embassy to Gaius. But Caligula Gaius seemed to have been appeased. He relented on setting up a statue of himself in the temple, and there was a curbing of the persecutions of the Jews in Alexandria. But ultimately, the situation of the Jewish population would only be improved in January 41 AD with the assassination by the Praetorian Guard of the Emperor Caligula. For Claudius would succeed him as the new emperor, and he would send a letter to Alexandria which reaffirmed the rights of the Jewish Alexandrians to maintain their religion and a direction for both parties to keep the peace. This decree, which Josephus records, states the following: "I wish therefore that the nation of Jews be not deprived of their rights and privileges on account of the madness of Gaius, but that those rights and privileges which they formerly enjoyed be preserved to them, and that they may continue in their own customs. And I charge both parties to take very great care that no troubles may arise after the promulgation of this edict." And so, peace and security is restored in Alexandria. For although the embassy to Gaius, led by Philo, achieved very little, there was on his account not much they could do, given the disposition of the emperor. But really, according to Philo, Herod Agrippa managed to avert the worst evils of Gaius, not only for the Jews in Alexandria, but in the very symbolic heart of the Jewish world, the temple in Jerusalem. And finally, any future conflict is averted because of the premature end of Caligula's reign by the assassination by the Praetorian Guard. Nonetheless, as the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Thessalonians almost 10 years later, while people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. For sadly, just 30 years after Gaius, the Roman general and future emperor Vespasian would fight a campaign against the Jews in Judea, which would ultimately lead to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the death of over 1 million Jews, according to Josephus, and eventually to the end of the Jewish population in Alexandria. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and please do subscribe, like and comment, and I'll see you next time. Bye!